Hello and welcome. Welcome to a new series of the Chancellor's Conversations. I'm very proud to be Chancellor of this great university, and I'm particularly proud as an organisation that we are a strong part of the community here in Canterbury, across Kent, and actually in various ways part of the wider European culture. In the 50th year of this university, I'm also very proud to see how well we are doing in terms of the university rankings and in terms of how satisfied our students are with what we do here. Over the next few months, I hope to help build on these strong links with conversations with cultural and political figures and leaders, ranging from, we hope, the crime novelist Ian Rankin to the film critic Mark Kermode, the cartoonist Gerald Scarfe, and others. And I am particularly pleased to kick off this series with someone who I believe is one of the most interesting politicians of our times, Lord Kinnock, Neil Kinnock, who is, of course, former leader of the Labour Party, a former Vice President of the European Commission, and a strong supporter not just of Britain's place in the EU, but also of the importance of universities. And as I was heading off this morning, my youngest daughter said to me, "What are you doing today?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to be interviewing." And I gave this list of titles, Lord Kinnock, what's that? Member of the House of Lords, I see. Former leader of the Labour Party, just not interested.
She's three.
She's three. But by a remarkable coincidence, she also goes to school with Lord Kinnock's granddaughter. And I said, Ceci's granddad. Oh, wow. So please, will you give a warm welcome to Ceci's granddad? Right. Let's get down to business. Let's talk about the one thing that's on most people's minds here, the general election and the result. Was it a complete surprise to you?
To me, not. And I say this as someone who, like the rest of you here, is also a film critic. But unlike most of you here, I provide cartoonists with a living. So consequently, I have a particular authority tonight. No, the election result didn't come as a complete surprise, or indeed a surprise at all, for two reasons. First, the huge number of don't knows, won't says in all those polls that put us at par or slightly ahead of the Conservatives for several weeks, indeed months. And when people don't know, won't say, it's because they've chosen not to tell the pollsters lies. And that is a tribute to them, I guess. Makes life a bit more difficult, but a tribute to them. And then secondly, within those who said they were going to support the Labour Party are always included people who think that's what they should say, because they are responsible citizens who recognize the obligations of living in society, the significance of a secure, well-financed National Health Service, of commitment to investment in education, lots of other things that they associate with the Labour Party, but are tempted all the time by the idea that they could forego these things because their kids are not in school, because they're not in immediate prospect of retirement, that they've got nobody going to university, or if they have, they can pay their own debts. And as a result, in the privacy of the voting booth, will, in their view, play safe. And there's always a proportion of those people. And that's always my reservation. It was in 1992. It was this time. And so I was devastated but not surprised on the night of May the 7th, when the exit polls showed what they showed, and the people I was with in the rugby club in Aberafon, my son's constituency, were very dismayed. And I said to my wife, these polls are right. It's going to be appalling. And I said to the rest of everybody, listen, this is not consistent with the polling. Don't believe it. And because they were together having worked like hell in the election, and I wasn't going to spoil their night for them. So for the next couple of hours, they lived on this inflatable balloon of expectation. They had a few drinks and some canapes and had a nice evening for longer than they otherwise would have. But that's how I appraised it.
When you didn't spoil their evening, but the result obviously did in the end.
It's going to spoil much more than that evening for them. Hell of a lot more.
Do you see any clear reason for defeat? I mean,
yeah.
I was just going to say before that, one of the things that people do, and they did with you, is they pin it on the leader. It was all Ed's fault. Now, how do you see it, and also how do you square that with the personality of the person in charge?
Well, on that element of the reason for defeat, it's certainly valid to say that the perception built around Ed Miliband was part of the reason, certainly a component of the reason for defeat, because from day one, the press almost universally had decided that he was an imposter, a union puppet, that he was actually a son of Lenin, and he was going to devastate the countryside, and it was going to be awful. And all that complete rubbish was pumped out. In fact, it was only reduced significantly by the closer perceptions of Ed Miliband, the genuine character, the highly intelligent and courageous human being, when he got unmitigated attention on television during the election campaign itself. That didn't mean that his performance was faultless. He's a human being. They couldn't be faultless. But people got a truer appreciation, which is why the gap in perceptions of capability closed. But for the 4.5 years before that, the constant refrain about Ed Miliband, not in just headlines or editorial writing, but in the drip, drip, drip of cartoons, gossip columns, opinion columns, and so on, was that this guy was at best a menace, at worst an idiot. And of course, he never was remotely either of those things. I get a certain sense of déjà vu, but nevertheless, the problem about déjà vu, it bloody well repeats itself. If there's a fault with Ed and his people, is that they never identified his genuine strengths and promoted public understanding of those strengths. And the strengths are, obviously, high intelligence. Even the enemy doesn't say otherwise. But also phenomenal coolness and courage. Now, to be courageous in battle, to fix your bayonet and charge at the enemy is highly creditable. To do it coolly when there's no immediate threat of attack, but to show courage under fire from Murdoch, from the Daily Mail, from the banks, from the energy companies, and to consistently make a cogent argument for change, that's a different kind of courage. It's the kind of courage you want in a leader. You want in the captain on the bridge, especially when the sea is rough. And they are the attributes that Ed has and had. They were never promoted specially. So my response on the leader is, the person who was leading the Labour Party was never given a fair chance, but he and the people working with him never told the truth with sufficient resilience and assertion in order to get a fairer appreciation of his considerable qualities.
But I was going to say to you, isn't it, there's nothing new in that because you went through it.
Yeah, but different altogether.
But it's his responsibility as leader of the Labour Party to know that other people are going to define him, and he didn't get his retaliation in first. I mean, he didn't define himself as this is exactly who I am, and maybe I look a bit of a geek, but you know what? That's fine. That's
okay.
Absolutely fine.
Absolutely.
But he didn't do that, did he?
Well, I preached. But for the accent, if he read the words you just used, he'd say, Kinnock wrote this. Because that was exactly the point that I was making, partly instructed by my own experience, even though Ed was on Mars, I was on Venus. I mean, the two make no comparisons. They're not really there, except for the hostility of the terrain. But part of the obligation of being a serious politician in a democracy is understanding the ground on which you're going to fight and the weapons that you've got and the other side have got. So nobody should be acquitted if they fail to understand that. And really, what prevented Ed from what I said, pulling on the T-shirt and celebrating his strengths as I identified them and as they really existed, was a genuine modesty, if you like, part of the geekiness, that people will appreciate me on the basis of my worth, which, when he said words like that, I said, well, now I apologize if anybody's going to be offended by these terms. That makes you a kind of creeping Jesus, as well as hiding your light under the bushel. You cannot be that precious, Ed. Like it or not, if other people are not going to tell the truth about you, you've got to tell the truth about you. And for admirable reasons, I can really respect him. He's a dear, dear friend and comrade of mine. For very, very decent reasons, understandable reasons, reasons for which I can respect him. He didn't do that.
Where do you think this leaves the party now, then? Because it's searching for a new leader, and you have also got, well, maybe we'll come to that leader in a moment, you've also got a very serious problem in Scotland.
Scotland is sometimes I think I wish there was a damn great zipper across and we could unzip it and let it float towards Iceland.
Well, you and 56 MPs north of the border.
Yeah, right. But as somebody whose name is Neil Gordon Kinnock, and some of his best friends are Scottish. And in any case, it wouldn't be the same thumping Scotland every year in the Six Nations Championship.
I didn't know we were going to get that.
If they were a truly foreign country. Anyway, those sentimental reasons apart, we've got a terrible problem. So let me do what politicians do and dwell on the problem rather than the answer for a moment. The problem is, two aspects of the problem are long and deep-seated. The other one is relatively recent. The relatively recent one is the fact that the Labour Party and leadership has allowed itself to be represented as not authentically part of the United Kingdom. It's wrong, it's a misperception, it's a complete misrepresentation, but nevertheless, they allowed that to happen and cannot be acquitted of that, and they're going, since you put it in the context of the next leadership, to have to dismantle that mythology. They really are authentic. They are from the people. They are from every part of the United Kingdom. They are familiar with the realities with which people, their own families, live in their own backgrounds, and they're going to have to repair that severe deficit of perception, which is Scottish as well as English and Welsh. So that's a general phenomenon they're going to have to deal with. In Scotland particularly, the long-dated, deep-seated problems are twofold. First, the kind of devolution we've got. Back in the late 1970s, when I was leading the campaign against the Callaghan-Foote government's proposals for devolution, I used to make several arguments. One of them was, if devolution is such a good idea, and it is for any Democrat, decentralization must commend itself, nobody can be against it, why not have it for everybody? And that would have meant building up what were then the metropolitan counties in parts of England to be genuine, devolved, local government-based authorities, accountable, close enough, regional enough to be recognizable, to attract affiliation and affection, loyalty, big enough to have economies of scale and to be good providers of education and police and social services. And I made that argument. I also made the argument there should be 3 assemblies in Scotland, 1 above Dundee and 2 in east and west southern Scotland, and 2 in Wales, 1 in North Wales, 1 in South Wales. Made that argument, didn't win the argument. Well, they had more numbers. That didn't mean that I wasn't right. But anyway, as the Scottish rugby football team says. But that fundamental mistake was made then. It was carried through into the Blair government. We had this half-baked form of devolution that had been conceived as a retreat, an appeasement in a mistaken response to a few by-election defeats by Scottish nationalists in the late 1960s and early 1970s. So they were asking the wrong question and giving the wrong answer to the question, which is why we've ended up with the form of devolution we've got, which means that a government in Edinburgh, doesn't have to be nationalist, but especially if it's nationalist, has a permanent excuse. It's not our fault, it's Whitehall and Westminster, and a permanent reason for offering the greener grass on the other side of the hill of what they call independence, what I call secession. So that's there, and the moment they started calling themselves Social Democrats, the attraction for disenchanted Labour voters in Scotland was illuminated completely. That wouldn't have been enough, were it not for the fact that for the last 30 or 40 years, with exceptions of utterly brilliant people, most of whom left Scotland and came to Westminster, not all, the Labour Party in Scotland has to be very, very, very polite and euphemistic, been sleepwalking, been somnambulant, been characterized by its lassitude. You can imagine the words going on in my head. I wouldn't dream of using them in mixed company in southeast England, or anywhere else, come to that. But it meant that as soon as the opportunity arose of objecting to a Labour Party which in seats with 20,000 majorities had less than 100 members, nearly all of them councillors, nearly all of them related to each other, they were going to strike back. If a party doesn't modernize, develop, cleanse, energize itself, the electorate will do it for you. And that's what happened in Scotland on May the 7th. Now, the question is, can we fight back? I think there are ways to do it. I think that we've got to recognize in the Labour Party we are now as much insurgents in Scottish politics as the SNP was 25 years ago, and we've got to do in 5 or 6 years what they took a quarter of a century to do. It's there to be done. the gaps are not as big as they were facing the SNP. It's going to require inventiveness, courage, dedication. There are people with those qualities in the Labour Party in Scotland, and they must prevail, assisted from the rest of the United Kingdom, because they are, in the best progressive tradition, unionists, and they must fight for the union. We must help them.
We've got, I'm pleased to say, quite a lot of questions have come in from members of the audience and other people interested in this, Neil. One from Alex Perkins. Do you agree Jeremy Corbyn is the only truly socialist option for Labour leader?
No, I don't, actually. Jeremy is my Member of Parliament. I would have been happy to vote for him if peers were allowed to vote. I'm a member of the party, his constituency party. I admire him greatly as a constituency MP, and several of the courageous and popular stances he's taken attract my respect. But what Jeremy knows and what I know is that if Jeremy became leader of the Labour Party, the difficulty of explaining our stances on a number of issues would be such as to diminish our ability to ever get power in order to serve the people and interests that as democratic socialists we stand for. Now, I'm not saying that he's treating politics as a hobby. Far from it. He's a serious guy and an admirable man in many ways. But that's not where the future of socialism is. My view is a democratic socialist is someone who considers that the major economic and political decisions governing a society should be consistent with the interests of that human society and accountable to that society. That's why I'm a democratic socialist. This was pretty much the definition of socialism by the French socialists before the Marxists came along, pretended that it was a science and stole the name socialism. And it's because of that emphasis on the well-being of society by comprehensible and practical means that I believe that democratic socialism exists, must flourish, and eventually be the cause that wins a mandate in the United Kingdom. Now, Jeremy doubtlessly believes that, but the way that which he wants to go about it involves, in a sense, no compromise with the conventions and expectations of the breadth of the British people. And that, I think, is his failing. Bertolt Brecht said, the play was great, the audience was terrible, so what we've got to do is change the audience. And Arthur Scargill's take on that was, the electorate is wrong, let's change the electorate by ignoring them. And we cannot, as parliamentarians, as democratic socialists, dream ourselves into a situation where, to go through one or two of Jeremy's commitments, we unilaterally abandon nuclear weapons. No more than 27% of the British people have ever said in any poll that they're willing to do that. If you don't believe me, you can come and see the bloodstained T-shirt that I've still got in the cupboard at home. There is no chance of the British people voting for the form of progressive taxation, admirable though it is, desirable though it is in many ways, that Jeremy would advocate. There is no possibility of the British people taking the leap of imagination in 5 years to the greening of the economy that Jeremy would, in many ways, rightly advocate. You live with the political conditions that confront you. You plan for the future. You represent in the present. You respect the past. But you don't think that you can help the have-nots by ignoring the haven't-got-enoughs and the haves. You must capture their understanding and support as well. And if Jeremy won't compromise to that extent, then he should not be the leader of the Labour Party. He should remain the excellent, outstanding Labour Member of Parliament with an increased majority in intelligent Islington.
All right. So who should lead the Labour Party?
Well, I'm going to be supporting Andy Burnham, and the reason is Andy's a thinking fighter. Obviously, we need someone with developed capacities to think, which involves some experience and the responsibility, if you can get it, of running major departments. But we also need a fighter, someone who will not be bowed, however bloodied he gets, by the experience of the coming years. And it is going to be difficult. Now, I think the other candidates have got the intellectual capacity, there's no doubt about that they are extremely bright. But I don't think that they've got that residual capacity of determination, of taking blows and giving them, of resilience that Andy Burnham has and will increasingly demonstrate. Now, as I said to Ed Miliband when I supported him, this is not a friendly gesture, pal. There is a great danger that with my support, you've increased your chances of getting elected. You will live to curse the day. And a couple of years in, he said, I'm cursing you. I understand what you meant. So I'm not doing Andy a favor in any way by endorsing him. I'm trying to do the Labour Party a favor because he's in for some years of great challenge, and I will be voting for him because I think he's up to it.
I want to throw it open to some questions from the floor if people have them in just a moment. But before we do, can we turn on to a really big issue for all of us in the United Kingdom, also in a university which is culturally so connected to Europe. The big vote next year, possibly, on membership of the European Union. I mean, do you see this as really important in the way I put it, or do you see this as a bit of a distraction?
Well, it has become and is, therefore, fundamental. We shouldn't be having the referendum. We are having the referendum because we've got a Prime Minister who is a miracle of biological science. He is definitely classified as a vertebrate. But he conceded his spine to some nutters in his own party and to UKIP. And those who live by appeasement die by appeasement. There was a young lady from Riga who went for a ride on a tiger. And we know what happened to the young lady from Riga. She finished up inside. Such is the fate of all appeasers in every sphere of life. And David Cameron's leadership of the Conservative Party is defined by the rapidity and breadth of the concessions he's made to an insurrectionary and incessant right wing in the Conservative Party. And his final gift to them, despite the sentiments that he expressed in his very famous lecture a couple of years ago, his concession to him is to have a referendum, which is a distraction, which has expense, political and otherwise, but most of all is a great risk. First of all, because of the shadow of uncertainty that it throws over our economy and business and investment decisions, and there's no avoiding that now. And secondly, in a referendum, there's always danger that the vote will be about the government and about half-informed sentiments and about fully felt prejudices. And as we've seen in other circumstances in referendums, we could, totally by mistake really, find ourselves by a small margin having voted for exit from the European Union, which would be cataclysmic. It doesn't mean that a plague will affect us and our country will die or anything like that. but it will inflict upon our country if that were the result. A series of complexities, difficulties, and expenses that are almost beyond imagination. If I had time, I'd measure one or two of them for you now. I'm certainly happy to do so, but life's too short for you people. But I'll come back during the referendum campaign and bore you to death with them. But that's why we've got it. Now then, that's what makes it so fundamental. The United Kingdom needs to be in the single market as an unqualified member of the European Union, and indeed as a major, highly influential member of the European Union. If we want reform, and we should, because there's a lot that can and should be changed in the European Union, I say this as someone who was a commissioner and proud to be so for 10 years, there are things in every human institution that can and must be changed, and that's certainly true of the European Union. And if we want to do that, the best place to do it from is in a position of influence, one, by impressing others in the Union with the originality and practicality of our views and with the effectiveness of our diplomatic relationships. Thus far, Mr. Cameron has done the opposite. So even the changes he wants, some of which are fairly innocuous, they can be dressed up to look grandiose, but pretty innocuous, others are simply not sustainable unless he gets treaty change, which he's not going to get. That is off the possibility list, even though he said he wants, quote, quote, full-on treaty change. That was 5 weeks ago. He's come to realize just a few weeks later, this guy is Prime Minister, who has been to several European councils, has encounters with other European Prime Ministers and heads of state on a daily basis, and it's taken him that time to learn there will be no treaty change. So that narrows the list down of what can be achieved. Still, some practical things can be done. But it's a massive issue that was avoidable on entirely democratic, practical, and sensible grounds. Those grounds were conceded by a short-term effort to appease and mollify extremist opinion, and our country is therefore plunged into the referendum debate. Okay, let's have it. Let's tell the truth. Let's go out and put things into perspective factually, and on the basis, hope that the British people are sufficiently receptive to the realities to vote yes when the time comes, next year or in 2017.
Let's take a moment and throw it open to members of the audience. If you'd like to ask a question, just put up your hand. And yeah, quite a few. There was a gentleman there who was first. Yeah, Mark.
Lord Kinnock, I remember you as a most...
Sorry.
I remember you as the most articulate, indeed outspoken leader of the Labour Party. I cannot imagine that if you were the leader recently, you would have allowed George Osborne and David Cameron to get away with the big lie that the last Labour government caused the financial crisis. But there it is. They've done that and done so very successfully. What can the Labour Party do about that?
Good question.
Thanks very much. Sorry, what's your name?
Richard Jones.
Richard, I must say, don't let's reflect on me. Let's reflect on why they got away with what you absolutely accurately called the big lie. And you are aware of the historic echoes of that phrase. And what I believe should have occurred and preached should have occurred, mainly privately, but also in various places that I spoke, and so I'm not being wise after the event, is the absolute fundamental, vital necessity of dismantling that lie from 2010 when it was being told. And I will simply give a couple of instances that demonstrate what a gigantic fabrication it was. This fabrication of Britain on the brink, used again by the Prime Minister last week, of Britain in danger of becoming Greece in the North Sea, of the economic mess that Labour left, the gigantic debt, etc., etc. I'll give a couple of figures. Sorry to resort to figures, but these are the truths from the Office of National Statistics. In 1998, 99, 2000, 2001, the Labour government ran a budget surplus. Other than the 2 years when Lawson ran a budget surplus, these were the only years of budget surplus since the 1920s, under all governments. In 2007-8, in 2004-5, that surplus turned into a deficit of around 2.5%. Went down to 2%, went up to 3%, but around there. Totally sustainable, well within the limits set by the Euro rules. No difficulty at all. 3-star credit rating, lowest ever bond yields, markets not spooked, no problem at all. It was actually going down in 6, 7, 8. And then it shot up. Why? Because we had the biggest economic and financial crash in the history of the world. And to their huge credit, Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling not only borrowed in order to forestall a gigantic economic catastrophe which would have shut every ATM in the country, let alone businesses of all sizes, as the economy fell right through the black hole. But they persuaded in the G7, G8, other countries simultaneously to run deficits and rescue the world from a cataclysmic collapse in the financial system. So our budget deficit went up from around 2.5% of GDP to 6.4%, then to 11% in 9-10. It immediately, of course, started falling because in 2009-10, growth was resumed, 2.1% in the United Kingdom. Employment up, unemployment down. 3-star credit rating, lowest ever bond yields, markets not spooked. A falling balance of payments deficit. And incomes rising at 0.5% above inflation. Remember those days? Now, revenue was coming in, and a recovery. It wasn't a land of milk and honey. Everybody here was alive then. You remember it. But it was an economy in recovery. The fabrication was that was a disaster. It was turned into a disaster because that recovery had its throat cut by the squeeze and the freeze. And it meant that whilst that deficit as a proportion of GDP was going down, so were incomes, and so were all the other indexes of economic success or failure. Our productivity rate now, 5 years later, is 15% below the historic trend in the United Kingdom, 30% behind our competitor countries, France, Germany, Belgium, Netherlands. And so what's represented as a long-term economic plan isn't a long-term economic plan because the regime introduced by George Osborne in 2010 so wrecked development that he had to change it in the budget of 2012. And it's only since then that growth has started to recover, but it's very fragile. As the Office of Budget Responsibility and National Statistics told us last week, private debt, household debt, is due to rise by 16% next year until it's at an absolute record level back to pre-crisis levels. You remember what caused the crisis? Excessive debt. We're back to those levels by 2017. Household debt rising much faster than household incomes. And public debt, the reason why we're running an 80 to 90 billion pound deficit, 5.5% of the GDP, is the way in which the economy is being squeezed. And yes, employment has gone up by 5%, but income tax revenues have gone down by 4% because of the extent of wage freezes in the public sector and flattened wages in the private sector. That's the truth that we should have been telling. Why? Not just for the entertainment of seekers after truth, but in order to dismantle the mythology of Greece in the North Sea and show what illiterate rubbish it was. We could never be that. Greece can't borrow in its own currency because the currency is the Eurozone. We in this country borrow because we've got the pound, thanks to Gordon Brown, in our own currency. 70% of our debt is owned by British institutions and citizens. 30% is abroad, institutionally held. No other country, not even Germany, is in that position. Our debt is a minimum 10-year dated. German debt is 3-year dated. Greek debt is 5 weeks dated. We got no problem. I'm not saying we should always run a huge deficit or anything like that, or have to pay the huge bills for national debt. Of course I'm not, because those bills have gone up from 24 billion under this utterly incompetent Labour government in 2010 to 51 billion under this super competent Conservative government in 2014-15. So those bills have gone up, and they're going to go on going up, because as long as productivity is lagging, output per hour is lagging so much as a consequence of the current economic regime, then we are going to have to keep on borrowing simply to sustain the economy. One last point about this mythology. When Labour went out of power in 2010, this utterly incompetent government was using 3.3% of GDP as public net investment. Schools, hospitals, transport, R&D, the things that enable the nation in the future to generate wealth, to pay its debts, but also to sustain a high standard of living. 3.3% of GDP. The OECD, which is the club of the richest nations in the world, recommends 3.5%. In order to maintain, this is his phrase a fortnight ago, competitiveness, and to ensure conditions of life for the growing UK population. I can read you the exact quote. I've got it in my bag by coincidence. Now, 3.3% was getting near around 3.5. This year, under this government that doesn't distinguish between cuts in welfare and cuts in investment, does it in both areas, it's 1.4%. The Red Book, published at the time of the budget in March, says that by 2017 it's going down to 1.2%. If they carry on at that rate, we'll be painting caves for our entertainment. A modern economy, as the OECD says, cannot sustain competitiveness or quality of life on that level of public investment. And God help the universities and research and culture and the development of the human spirit, creativity, imagination, and dare I use the word aspiration, when the country is being impoverished like that. They say they don't want to leave debt for future generation. Okay, let's leave them with a dysfunctional transport system. Let's leave them with dirty air. Let's leave them with underfunded universities. Let's leave them with underpaid jobs. Let's leave them with underproductivity. Let's leave them with no means of generating wealth to pay out the debt or to maintain living standards. That's the alternative. And now the guy says last night he's going to illegalize deficits. Oh my God. Who's got a mortgage in this house? Who's got a mortgage? Not credit card debt, a mortgage, an investment debt. Has anybody not got a mortgage here? Well, good for you. You are part of Britain's growing rented sector. When Labour went out of office, the average age at which people got their first mortgage to start buying their own home in this property-owning democracy was 27. Now it's 36. And with a bit of luck, you'll be able to use whatever you get when you retire as a down payment for your first house. By not dismantling the lie, the big lie, as Richard says, we couldn't tell the big truth about what it means and what it needs to enable a modern economy to thrive, to grow. And of course, you have to grow and produce before you can distribute with justice. The two objectives in a modern economy are not just parallel desirables, they are absolutely interlinked. Without social justice, you simply do not foster the talent or the security necessary to produce enterprise, creativity, to make for the future. You can't do it without social justice in a modern economy. But if you don't use that to foster economic efficiency, lower marginal costs, innovation, creativity, competitiveness, you are never going to generate the surpluses necessary to keep on raising standards of social justice. In a modern economy, the two are completely interlinked. It's a very, very simple prospect. I know from every audience I've spoken to of all kinds of levels of formal education and lack of it, that people comprehend in practical terms these two ideas and why they're interdependent in modern society. If you try to extract one from the other, both lose. And what you get is not just the injustice, but the gigantic expense and inefficiency of gross and growing inequality. That's the story we should have been telling. And it would have provided us with a basis of truth, sticking to the facts of truth on which to build our narrative of how things could, in practical, rational, reasonable, reachable terms, be different. They sustained the lie. We didn't demolish it. We didn't use the facts. So we didn't develop our narrative. That's why we're here sitting under a Tory government that wants to illegalize deficits on this day.
Let's take a couple more questions from the floor. Gentleman here.
I'm almost scared to ask a question, though.
Sorry, I promise you the answer won't be as long. I honestly God.
But it might be as passionate.
There's a mic there, sorry.
Thank you. George Kennedy. You mentioned just briefly about spooking the market. I personally worry about that because lots of us have pension funds involved in the market, and if it bombs, we're in trouble. If Greece defaults completely, will Mrs. Merkel support them forever, or do you think there is an Armageddon coming in Greece?
That's a very interesting question because obviously it's got greater repercussions immediately in the Eurozone than it has on us. But even an economy of that size, 10 million people, can't effectively be made absent for a period from international transactions without having a knock-on effect for everyone. So this stone dropped in the middle of the pond will wash over us as well, cause the wave to wash over us as well. There are several options to Mrs. Merkel. She can either listen to Schäuble, finance minister, who I've met. I can't say he's a friend. I can't say I know him very well, but I see what he's saying, and he's wrong. Austerity, the austerity that's being practiced there as here, is a way of dealing with a chronic shortage of demand by reducing demand. It's like an athlete losing weight by amputating a leg. It's the opposite. It's smoking for health. It's the opposite of what should be done. Now, I'm not saying that the Germans or the rest of the Eurozone should pour largesse onto Greece. They must make any provision conditional as they have, but not the crazy squeezed conditions that exist now and are currently requiring the Greek government to reduce old age pensions, for instance, already reduced by half from about 1,200 euros a month to 700 euros a month by a further, until we're probably talking about something like 150 euros a week, 110 pounds a week for everything. Now, that can't be done. You can't take that much demand out of the economy without having huge economic effects. You can't inflict that kind of difficulty on a vulnerable section of society without causing uproar. So what they're insisting on from the Eurozone, the ECB, the Commission, God help us, and the German government, the Eurozone members, is the opposite of what should be done. Now, that's not saying you give Greece a complete license. That wouldn't be good for them either. They've got to collect more taxes. They've got to show more fiscal discipline and much greater transparency and better organization after decades and decades, hundreds of years, in which that hasn't existed. I got my own theory that because of the centuries and the Byzantine rule, when not paying your taxes was a patriotic act, that somehow has got stuck in the Greek psyche. And I've got Greek friends of mine who will offer that testimony of themselves. Anyway, I don't know whether it's right or wrong, but certainly whatever the cause of it, it's been a major problem. Now they've got to get out of that problem, but they've got to be given the space in which to do it, and they're not being given that. One of the options available to Angela Merkel, and I'm sure this would be her instinct as a definitively sensible, pragmatic person. She's an admirable woman in so many ways. We wouldn't vote in the same column, but I hugely respect Angela Merkel. I think she's a terrific woman with great judgment, massive maturity, and enormous courage. And I hope she prevails, because I'm certain her instinct is to say, here's the Eurozone, let's treat Greece as if it was one of the federal states of the USA, nearly all of which run huge budget deficits, none of which are allowed to go bankrupt, because the federal government makes provision for them against the certainty of future tax contributions. And there's nothing to prevent the Eurozone from doing that with Greece, giving it space to breathe, imposing conditions, but not irrational squeezes that forbid growth in the Greek economy and devastate the standard of living of people. The only beneficiaries of that taken to the next step would be the Nazi party in Greece. And Syriza is a radical leftist party with terrific confidence and intelligence. You've just got to watch them and hear them to know that, who have got some sensible proposals to make that should be accepted and negotiated. The alternative to them is a great big swing in Greece to the right, which would be menacing. Nobody should forget the geographical location of Greece, absolutely adjacent to a Middle East which is in chaos. That should not be absent from consideration either.
I think we've got time for one more question. Yep, the gentleman up the back who's either waving in distress or is very keen to talk. Maybe both.
Well, he can't be droning there.
He can't be droning up there,
Must
can
be
he?
waving.
You've said that you're supporting Andy Burnham for the Labour leadership, but given that he's got such a surplus of nominations needed to be part of the contest, and that Jeremy Corbyn's the only candidate who's outwardly been advocating the party taking an anti-austerity stance, if he doesn't make enough nominations to be part of the contest by Monday, should Burnham donate the surplus of his nominations to allow that debate?
No.
Right. Got that one.
Sometimes the nice guys come second. Need I say more? I'm not letting out a family secret by saying my son has actually publicly made the argument, together with one or two other MPs, that in the manner of David Miliband and what was her name from Hackney?
Diane Abbott?
Diane Abbott. This largesse should enable her to get up, which enabled her to get over the nomination line, should be repeated, and Andy should redistribute his votes over 35 to Jeremy, to Mary Cray, and all the rest of it. And that argument is publicly being made. I just disagree with it, because the reality is that if someone cannot get the first preference and nomination of the required number, 15% after all, of the Parliamentary Labour Party, they are not going to be able to lead the Labour Party in Parliament or outside. And so consequently, the rule exists for a reason, that it is a reasonable minimalist test of people who can command enough support from those with which he or she is going to have to work most closely on a 7-day-a-week basis. And if you can't get that support, then you shouldn't be on the ballot paper. And to me, that's basic. It's democratic, but almost more important, it's realistic. And it recognizes the disposition of forces and preferences in a way that ultimately democracy must do. We're assisted by the fact that the only part of the election that is, if you like, first past the post is the nomination procedure. Everything else after that is immaculately proportional representation. So I don't think that we should install a form of charitable concessionary lame duck PR at the nomination stage. We're all grown-ups. Let's face it, you either get 35 or you don't.
Neil, just one area that you touched on earlier, just to close off our proceedings, obviously in a university audience, the future of the universities, and whether, you know, you were the first Kinnock in 1,000 generations to go to university. Yeah. Funny, I heard Joe Biden say that. I wonder,
yeah, that's right.
Did he?
What happened to Joe Biden?
What happened to Joe Biden? Yeah, he did all right. I mean, do you see the future of universities as being the path of aspiration for working class kids who come from, or people who come from a mining background, as your family was? I mean, is it the same as it was for your generation? Is it different now? Is it changed utterly by fees and the ways in which we have to pay for universities?
Well, if we had any miners, it would be a start, wouldn't it? No,
Good point.
I'm the same short-termism that put paid to the coal mining industry, thanks to Arthur Scargill and Margaret Thatcher, who deserved each other, though nobody else did, is the same kind of attitude that could pose a threat to the vitality of universities in the United Kingdom, one of our great assets and splendors. Because of the innate vitality of universities and the value, I don't think that the future of universities is in jeopardy, but that doesn't mean it is not threatened. What I'm fearful of is that universities, by financial pressure, can be, and I'm sorry to use a sexist term, but it's because I can't think of any other one, be emasculated by imposing upon them obligations to strip out departments and to lose staff and to diminish expertise and to increase class sizes. And despite the rising cost of going to university, and I don't just mean tuition fees, I mean the other big cost, often bigger, of living while you're in university, adding to the debt obligation, all those things coming together to dilute the offer and the experience of university. So I think that's got to be safeguarded against. I think the argument has got to be made that investment in education generally and universities as a whole, as an absolutely essential stratum and contributor to the national well-being, economically, culturally, scientifically, socially, technologically, internationally, that argument has got to be made on the basis of this crucial value of investment. We have got to beat the people who argue that somehow the country can be better off in some way, God knows how, by dumbing down and by impoverishing universities as a great cradle of everything that we need for the present and the future. Alongside that, however, we have got to dismantle any idea that exists that the only path to advance, to excellence, to fulfillment, to cultural and economic output is via the form of higher education we've got now. We've got a great misfortune in Britain of having something called education and alongside it something called training, of having academic education and something called vocational education. Both suffer, as does the country. I won't go into my historic thesis about why this binary stupidity exists, but it does exist. And it impoverishes us as it impoverishes and demeans individuals. So we've got to make a huge effort, and it's got to be a matter of government policy, but also recognition across the breadth of our society that to nourish what are now called the vocational skills is absolutely vital to the advancement of imagination and intellect as well as output, and that the whole of the society is greatly diminished if we don't do that. Now, I'm not saying the Germans or the Danes or the Swedes or the Dutch have got it absolutely right, and they would not claim. Maybe the Danes would, because they always claim they got the best of everything. They've just got the best prime minister at the moment, but but they're damn sight nearer to addressing the realities of the breadth of human capacity, the breadth of opportunity needed in modern societies, and the breadth and depth of potential in every rising generation, much nearer to it than we are. So we've got to find ways of emulating, or more realistically, making our own British model of what they have developed over decades in order to strengthen our society and our performance and to give real fulfillment to those who aspire to advance beyond where their parents left them or previous generations, or to a different kind of greatness and realization of their talents. And that's in the national interest, in the most literal terms. Now, I think one of the greatest articulators of that argument is our universities, if I can speak of them individually and collectively at the same time, themselves. It is people from the universities that have been making these arguments. They need to forge even closer alliances and much better lobbying to make the life of a government that doesn't recognize these realities insufferable. At any given time, the universities in this country have got an army of at least 600,000 directly involved, of another 10 or 12 million who owe everything they've got to going to university, and that's without their mums and dads and grandmums and granddads. So the opportunity for mobilization in favor, literally, of educational opportunity to its fullest for all in the interests of the country, in the advancement of civilization, is there to be had. So that's the requirement that I would offer, that the universities do it with a unity and a force that has never been shown before. In fact, I believe that unlike the well-intentioned and absolutely generous and brilliantly functioning social services, or schooling systems, or police forces, the one force in our society that really can, in a short time, demonstrate and convince the general public that unless they vote for the advancement of education, they are doomed, is the universities. They've got a position of very, very, very substantial numbers, of great respect, of recognition of their output and potential, not enough recognition of their potential, but that can come. And so they've got to organize themselves as an insurrectionary army and overthrow current prejudices, short-sightedness, myopia, meanness, lack of vision for the future, betrayal of the interests of rising generations. And I think it requires a really piratical, original spirit. Genteel lobbying in the offices of Whitehall must be done, but it's not going to be enough. Go on the street, don't smash anything. Not even a beer mug. And if you get arrested, stick people before the university court so they're sent down. Don't fine them, don't put them in jail, just ruin them for being indisciplined in the cause of the revolution. Because that is the kind of spirit that's going to need to be organized. Everybody from the noblest, most enlightened and revered professor through to the scruffiest new undergraduate, they've got to be part of this, because the future really, their future, and certainly their community and country's future, maybe their world's future, certainly their children's future, depends entirely upon the success that they achieve in the next few years when the system is under real, gradual, corrosive, almost secret threat, but nevertheless, lethal threat. They've got to fight back, and it's got to be done now.
Before you all go to the barricades, let me thank you for being a great audience.
If you're big enough, there won't even be any barricades.
We have got a big challenge, it seems to me, from what you just said, and that will give us something to think about greatly in the weeks ahead. I'd just like to thank, particularly for the first of these Chancellor conversations, Lord Kinnock. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
That was really good.